Imagine holding a device that 50% of the people on Earth use.
Right, not just 50% of a specific demographic, but half the entire globe.
Half the world relying on the exact thing your company makes to connect, to do business, to live their lives.
It's a level of market penetration that borders on a complete monopoly.
Yeah.
I mean, in the technology hardware space, it is almost unfathomable today.
That really is. And now I want you to imagine losing almost all of that in just 6 years.
A total collapse.
Yes. Today, we are conducting a deep dive into this exact phenomenon. We have a massive stack of sources here: business case studies, financial reports, academic research, and insider accounts.
And our mission today is to unpack the spectacular rise, the catastrophic fall, and the genuinely surprising rebirth of Nokia.
Because, frankly, the sheer scale of Nokia's peak is difficult to comprehend in today's highly fragmented smartphone market. We are splitting this investigation into two distinct halves. First, we will detail their rise to absolute, undisputed global dominance.
We have to establish that peak before we can analyze the fall.
Exactly. And in the second half, we will transition to the rapid and devastating decline, pulling apart the internal organizational rot and the leadership failures that caused it. Okay, let's unpack this. We need to start with the scale of their peak.
Right, because this isn't just a simple story about a company failing to build a touchscreen.
That is the popular mythology, isn't it?
It is. People think, oh, Apple announced the iPhone, and Nokia just ignored it until they died.
But the reality documented in our sources is so much more complicated.
And honestly, much more terrifying for any successful business. This is a profound lesson in technical debt, organizational fear, and what we can call the toxicity of success.
The toxicity of success, that is a chilling phrase, and we are going to dig deep into what that actually looks like inside a boardroom.
It is entirely clinical.
But to understand the collapse, we really have to understand the absolute supremacy they achieved first. And to do that, we have to go back to the beginning, which, surprisingly, starts with wood pulp.
It does. And I think it establishes a historical pattern of radical transformation that is crucial context for their later strategic moves.
The origin story is wild. Based on the historical documents we have, the company was founded in 1865 in Tampere, Finland.
By a mining engineer, right? Frederick Idestam.
Yes, Frederick Idestam. He opened a single paper mill. That was it. And it makes sense. I mean, paper was a booming industry during the industrialization of Europe.
It was a very safe physical industry.
But then, as the decades pass, they just keep absorbing completely unrelated industries.
Right.
By 1967, they officially merged with the Finnish rubber works, which had been around since 1898, making rubber boots and tires.
Right.
And they also merged with the Finnish cable works, which started in 1912. So you have this Frankenstein conglomerate making toilet paper, rubber boots, car tires, and electrical cables.
You really have to view that through the lens of the Finnish economy at the time.
Yes.
Well, it was a relatively small, developing industrial base. So combining these heavy industries under one corporate umbrella made perfect financial sense. But the cable division is where the seed of their future was actually planted.
Because of the electrical components.
Exactly. In 1960, the electronics division emerged directly from that cable business. They started building radio telephones for the military and emergency services.
Which is a massive leap. I mean, going from rubber boots to military radio telephones, how do you even justify that transition internally?
Geographic necessity. If you think about the geography of the Nordic countries, Finland, Sweden, Norway, you have vast, dense forests, extreme weather, and a very sparse population.
Right. Running physical telephone cables to every remote home would be impossible.
Economically impossible. So the Nordic countries had a desperate, highly practical need for wireless communication long before the rest of the world.
Ah, that makes perfect sense. The harsh environment literally forced the innovation.
It did. And that is exactly why they were pioneers. Under the leadership of CEO Kari Kairamo in the 1980s, they pushed for aggressive international expansion.
The sources show they were instrumental in launching the Nordic Mobile Telephone, or NMT network, in 1981.
Yes, the NMT. That was the world's first fully automatic cellular phone network.
And this is when the physical phones start showing up. They released the Mobira Senator car phone in 1982.
A classic device.
I looked up the archival photos of this thing for this deep dive. It looks like a car battery with a rotary dial attached to it. It weighed about 10 kilograms.
Highly portable for the era. relatively speaking.
Right, and they quickly followed that up with the iconic Cityman 900 in 1987.
That was one of the first true handheld mobile phones. Mikhail Gorbachev was famously photographed using one, which earned it the nickname the Gorbaphone.
But they weren't just doing phones at this point. They were still acting like a sprawling conglomerate, right? Our financial reports show they overexpanded into consumer electronics in the late 80s.
Specifically television manufacturing. And it was a financial disaster.
They couldn't compete.
Not at all. They were trying to compete with massive Asian and European TV manufacturers and failing terribly. The company was actively bleeding money toward the late 1980s and early 1990s. They were in a serious existential crisis.
Which sets the stage for one of the most ruthless corporate pivots in business history.
Absolutely ruthless.
In 1992, Jorma Ollila takes over as CEO, and he looks at this bleeding monster of a company making boots, TVs, cables, and paper, and makes a massive strategic decision.
He amputates the historical foundations of a century-old company.
Exactly. He divests almost everything. He sells off the rubber. He sells off the paper. He abandons the consumer electronics. He decides Nokia is going to do exactly one thing, and that is telecommunications.
It is a staggering gamble. To focus on an emerging, unproven technology requires immense executive conviction.
But he saw the trend, right?
He did. He saw the global adoption of the GSM digital standard, which Nokia had actually helped develop. And he recognized that mobile phones were about to shift from luxury business tools to global consumer necessities.
And the gamble pays off flawlessly. The financial data from our sources is incredible here. By 1998, they overtake Motorola to become the #1 mobile phone maker in the world.
A monumental shift in global market power.
And we are talking about cultural icons here. The Nokia 6100 series sold 41 million units in 1998 alone. That's the phone that introduced the mobile game snake.
Which arguably single-handedly normalized the idea of looking at your phone for entertainment rather than just utility.
It was the precursor to the entire app economy. And then, of course, the data highlights the Nokia 3310, the indestructible brick.
A marvel of hardware engineering.
It sold over 126 million units globally. People still make memes today about the 3310 surviving a nuclear blast. You could drop it down a flight of stairs, the battery would fly out, you'd snap it all back together, and it still had 3 days of battery life.
To put that 126 million units into perspective, the global market for mobile phones was expanding at an unprecedented rate, largely in emerging markets.
And Nokia was capturing the lion's share of all that new growth.
Precisely. By 1999, their profits hit an astonishing $4 billion.
Okay, let's unpack this specific metric, because the mechanics of that supremacy are what we really need to dissect as investigators. How did they win so decisively?
Right. Why couldn't Motorola or Ericsson keep up?
Exactly. Our sources indicate it wasn't merely that Nokia had good, sturdy phone designs. It was their absolute, unquestioned mastery of the supply chain.
That is the crucial differentiator. They implemented a highly specialized methodology known as design for manufacturing, or DFM.
Walk me through that, because to a layperson, designing something so it can be manufactured sounds, well, obvious. What made Nokia's DFM so revolutionary?
Is the difference between building a bespoke, beautiful object and building a machine that builds millions of objects. Nokia's engineering teams didn't just design a phone. They engineered the exact movements the machines and assembly line workers would take to put the phone together. They engineered the process to eliminate every single unnecessary millimeter of movement, or extra screw.
So they are optimizing the factory floor before the physical phone even exists in reality.
Precisely. And underneath the hood, they used only 3 or 4 core base units, which they called engines, for all their various phone models.
Like a car chassis.
Exactly like a car chassis. You have the same engine and wheelbase, but on top you can put a sedan body, a truck body, or a sports car body. Nokia would take these 3 or 4 standardized engines and attach about 150 different types of covers, keyboards, and small aesthetic components.
That perfectly explains the crazy variety of Nokia phones back then. You had the flip phones, the slider phones, the ones with full keyboards. To the consumer, it looked like endless, rapid innovation.
But internally, they were just snapping different cheap plastic shells onto the exact same core engine.
And that standardization allowed them to achieve a scale that is genuinely hard to wrap your head around. The data from the case studies notes that at their absolute peak, Nokia's factories were churning out mobile phones at a rate of up to 15 devices a second.
Every single time the second hand ticks on a clock, 15 Finnish mobile phones are coming off an assembly line.
That metric alone is mind-bending. 15 a second.
It translates to 500 million phones a year.
500 million.
Yes. And it requires between 80 to 140 billion individual components annually. Screens, batteries, microchips, plastic casings, keypads.
And they were doing this with almost zero inventory, right? How is that physically possible? I mean, if you were moving 140 billion parts, you would think they would need warehouses the size of small countries just to hold the screws.
They operated on a hyper-optimized, demand-driven logistics model. The components needed for the final stages of production were ordered with just a 24-hour lead time from suppliers.
A 24-hour lead time on that scale.
Yes. They literally forced their component suppliers to build factories in the immediate vicinity of the Nokia assembly plants.
Oh, wow. So they bullied the supply chain. They essentially said, if you want our business, you build your factory next door to ours.
It was a symbiotic but highly dominant relationship. There were no massive warehouses of unsold parts gathering dust. Production runs were executed essentially to order, managing a distribution chain spanning 170 countries.
It sounds like a perfectly synchronized industrial ballet.
It was, and it allowed them to achieve profit margins that competitors simply could not touch. Ericsson and Motorola were getting absolutely crushed on hardware margins.
And Nokia was taking those massive margins and pouring them directly back into the company. The R&D spending documented in the sources is another crucial data point for us to look at.
It shows they weren't just resting on their laurels.
Not at all. In 1991, their R&D spending was about 5.5% of their total sales. By 2000, it almost doubled to 9%.
And by 2005,
By 2005, our sources show Nokia's R&D expenses totaled an astonishing 3.8 billion euros. That represented 11.2% of their net sales for that year. They were actively trying to engineer the future.
they were, and a large portion of that R&D went into localization strategies, putting them far ahead of the competition globally.
Right, because true global dominance requires local adaptation.
Exactly. You can't just sell an American or European phone in Asia and expect it to dominate without friction.
The sources mention the Chinese market, specifically around 1999.
Yes, they recognized the vast potential of China, but they knew a Western interface built around the Latin alphabet wouldn't suffice for a tonal, character-based language.
So they engineered a solution.
They developed a specific Chinese user interface. They engineered predictive text specifically for Chinese characters, which effectively cracked open the Asian market for them. They localized not just the language, but the hardware aesthetics, the marketing, and even the local carrier partnerships.
All of this culminates in the staggering peak metrics of 2007. Based on the financial reports, Nokia holds roughly a 50% global market share in mobile phones.
And specifically, 49.4% in the rapidly growing smartphone sector.
The company is valued at roughly $250 billion. They are the undisputed king.
By every traditional metric of business success, market share, profit margin, brand recognition, supply chain efficiency, Nokia in 2007 is a perfect company.
But looking at this through our analytical lens, I have to ask a structural question. We just spent all this time outlining this hyper-efficient, massive manufacturing apparatus. We have factories churning out 15 identical plastic components a second.
Right.
If you optimize a massive global corporation to build millions of the exact same cheap, efficient hardware components, doesn't that make it physically and culturally impossible to build something entirely different when the market suddenly demands it?
You have just defined the economic concept of path dependence.
Right.
And you have identified the exact structural vulnerability that initiated their downfall.
Path dependence. Break that down for me in this specific context.
Path dependence means that the strategic decisions you make today are strictly limited by the decisions you made in the past.
Okay.
Nokia's design for manufacturing model was brilliant for producing high volumes of standardized hardware, but it created a deep institutional rigidity. The entire company, the engineers, the supply chain managers, the executives, they were hardwired to think in terms of hardware efficiency, component miniaturization, and cost reduction.
So if you are an executive whose entire career is based on finding a way to shave 1/10 of a cent off the cost of a plastic keypad, you are literally incapable of seeing the value in a software ecosystem.
Precisely. They were blind to the fact that the underlying paradigm of the entire mobile industry was about to invert. This obsession with hardware efficiency masked a growing, invisible rot in their software.
And this brings us directly into the second half of our deep dive, the decline, and specifically the Symbian trap.
The Symbian trap is fascinating.
In 2007, Symbian is the dominant operating system on the planet. The reports show it commands a 65.6% global OS market share. It was originally formed back in 1998 as a joint venture between Nokia, Ericsson, Motorola, and Sown.
And the stated goal was basically to prevent Microsoft from dominating mobile devices the way they dominated personal computers with Windows.
And for almost a decade, it worked flawlessly.
It did work. And what we have to understand now is how the very architecture of Symbian, which was the source of its initial massive strength, became its fatal flaw.
How so? Walk us through the technical architecture.
Symbian was designed in an era when mobile processors were incredibly weak, memory was highly expensive, and battery life was paramount. The core code of Symbian was incredibly resource efficient. It could run a smartphone for a week on a tiny battery.
Which is why we all remember charging our Nokias only once a week.
Exactly. But to achieve that extreme efficiency, the software was entirely device-centric. It was deeply intertwined with the specific hardware it was running on.
Meaning it was not modular.
Right, it was not modular.
Explain modularity for the listeners, just to establish the technical baseline here.
Think of a modular operating system like a standard power outlet in your house. You can plug in a toaster, a lamp, or a television, and they all just work because the interface, the plug, is standardized.
Okay, that makes sense. Apple's iOS and Google's Android are highly modular.
Yes. App developers write code for the operating system, and the operating system figures out how to talk to the specific camera, screen, or processor of the physical phone.
Got it. So what was Symbian doing instead?
Symbian was like trying to wire that toaster directly into the electrical mains in your walls, skipping the outlet entirely.
Oh, wow.
Every single time Nokia designed a new piece of hardware, say they wanted to add a slightly better camera or change the screen resolution, the software engineers essentially had to rewrite customized deep-level C++ code to make Symbian work on that specific device.
That sounds like a complete logistical nightmare. If Symbian is trying to install smart home tech into a house with 19th century plumbing, you just keep patching pipes until the whole thing bursts.
It was a nightmare, and it was built for a pre-touch screen world characterized by physical keypads and small screens.
And then in 2007, Steve Jobs walks out on a stage in California, and the entire paradigm shifts.
The iPhone launches.
Followed quickly by the Android open source platform in 2008. Suddenly, the value isn't in the hardware at all.
No, the hardware is just a black rectangle of glass.
The value is entirely in the software ecosystem.
What's fascinating here is that the core competitive advantage shifted overnight from hardware miniaturization, which Nokia was the undisputed king of, to software ecosystems, third-party application development, and intuitive user experience.
The battleground moved.
Exactly. Chipset companies began integrating multiple functions into single processors, meaning you didn't need a hardware genius to make a small phone anymore. The battleground moved from the motherboard to the touchscreen and the App Store.
And this is where Nokia's internal structure just completely paralyzes them. Because Symbian was not modular, and because Nokia was obsessed with segmenting the market with dozens of different phone models, remember those 150 different covers and engines we analyzed earlier?
I do.
Our sources show that by 2009, Nokia was maintaining 57 different incompatible versions of the Symbian operating system.
57. It is an indefensible allocation of engineering resources.
If I am a third-party app developer in 2009 trying to build a game or a weather app, I am absolutely not going to write 57 different versions of my code just to cover the Nokia user base.
No rational developer would.
I'm going to write one version for iOS and one version for Android, and I'm going to call it a day.
And that is exactly what happened. The Nokia ecosystem collapsed because it was too fragmented to support developer growth. Without apps, the phones lost value to consumers, regardless of how sturdy or cheap the hardware was.
And furthermore, the internal technological battles at Nokia were draining whatever resources they had left. The academic sources we are analyzing highlight a massive internal clash over microprocessors right around 2007.
Yes, the microprocessor civil war.
The nomadic versus Rapuyama battle. This is a perfect, highly clinical example of their path dependence blinding them.
Explain the divide there based on the documents.
So the company's engineers were deeply divided between two completely different chipset architectures. On one side, you had the nomadic chip. This was designed by Texas Instruments for high-end performance, multimedia, and heavy software processing.
It was exactly what you would need to run a modern touchscreen smartphone to rival the iPhone.
Exactly. On the other side, you had the Rapuyama chip. This was a legacy architecture optimized for one thing only, and that was low-cost efficiency.
And top management, led by CEO Olli-Pekka Kallasvuo, had to make a definitive choice.
They chose Rapuyama. They chose the low-cost, low-power option because the bulk of their revenue at that exact moment was still coming from high-volume, low-margin feature phones in emerging markets. They looked at their massive profit margins, looked at the iPhone, and decided, we aren't going to sacrifice our margins for computing power.
They optimized for current cash flow at the direct expense of future capability. As a result, they severely handicapped their high-end smartphones.
Just tragic.
They were literally trying to compete with the iPhone's computing power using inferior, cost-optimized processors designed for feature phones. It was technologically impossible.
The data points on the fallout from this are damning. Because of this massive technical debt, the slow processors, and the sheer complexity of that tangled, non-modular Symbian code, it was taking Nokia an agonizing 22 months to develop and release a new Symbian phone.
Almost 2 full years from concept to consumer.
Compare that to less than a year for their rivals using Android or iOS.
In an industry where market trends were shifting by the week, a 2-year lead time is a death sentence.
By the time a Nokia engineer finished writing the deep-level C++ code for a new camera, the iPhone had already released 2 newer generations of cameras.
But here is the fundamental question that demands an analytical answer. If the engineering data was so clear and the 22-month lead time was so obviously fatal, why didn't they just scrap Symbian the second they saw the iPhone in 2007?
Right.
They had the money. They had $4 billion in profit. They could have licensed Android immediately.
Here is where it gets really interesting. Because scrapping a proprietary system that is currently actively generating billions of euros in revenue requires an incredible amount of corporate bravery. And that bravery was completely absent from Nokia.
Why? What does the research show?
It points to a deep, systemic organizational rot. And this brings us to the findings of a pivotal academic study by Timo Vuori from Aalto University and Kui Hui from INSEAD Singapore.
This study is a cornerstone of our analysis today.
It really is. They conducted an extensive qualitative analysis of Nokia's management practices. They interviewed 76 top and middle managers, and they identified the root cause of this paralysis.
It wasn't stupidity.
No, it was organizational fear.
This is where the clinical postmortem gets psychological and, frankly, deeply revealing for any corporate structure.
The Vuori and Hu study pinpoints a devastating matrix reorganization that Nokia implemented back in 2004.
We need to define what that actually meant for the people working there. The intention behind the matrix was supposedly positive.
They wanted to break down silos, increase cross-departmental agility, and foster innovation.
Right. But in practice, a matrix organization means you no longer have one boss. You have a boss for your product, a boss for your region, and a boss for your function.
You shift from small, autonomous, entrepreneurial teams, which is how Nokia operated in the 90s, to a complex web where a single middle manager suddenly has to report to 3 different department heads.
All of whom have conflicting goals. It grinds decision-making to an absolute halt. It replaced the entrepreneurial spirit with a heavy, combative bureaucracy.
And critically, it created a system where middle management became terrified of top management. The study reveals a highly toxic environment. Top management at Nokia largely lacked technical engineering competence.
This is a stark contrast to Apple, where Steve Jobs and his top executives were intimately familiar with software architecture and design limitations. Nokia's executives were supply chain guys and finance guys.
So you have executives who don't understand software, demanding aggressive, often completely unrealistic, quarterly financial targets from the software engineers.
And according to the study, these executives applied immense pressure and were known to be temperamental, even bullying, when those targets weren't met.
Which leads to a perfectly predictable human reaction. If I am a middle manager in that matrix and my engineers come to me and say, Symbian is failing, the code is too fragile, it takes 22 months to build a phone, we are years behind Apple, what do?
You look at the systemic pressure.
Exactly. I look at these aggressive financial targets, I look at my angry, non-technical boss, and I realize that telling the truth means getting screamed at or fired.
So you lie.
Yes, they lied. According to the interviews with these 76 managers, they literally lied about the capabilities of Symbian and the progress of alternative software platforms because they feared losing their jobs. The information flowing up the corporate ladder was artificially sanitized.
It is the textbook definition of the toxicity of success.
Dominating a market for a decade breeds a dangerous mix of arrogance and conservatism at the top. Top management believed their own mythology.
They assumed their global brand power, their carrier relationships, And their massive hardware supply chain would insulate them from any software deficiencies.
And because the internal feedback loop was corrupted by fear, they were essentially flying blind into a hurricane. So it wasn't that Nokia didn't see the iPhone or Android coming. It was that their internal culture was like the emperor's new clothes. Nobody was brave enough to tell the boss the software was naked.
And while they're paralyzed by this fear and bureaucracy, the market is moving at light speed. The financial divergence is staggering.
Let's look at those numbers.
Apple's profits boom by 330% between 2007 and 2010. Nokia's profits fall by 30% in that exact same window. The burning platform is fully alight, even if management refuses to smell the smoke.
But the board of directors finally smells the smoke. In September 2010, they take drastic action. They replace the CEO, Olli-Pekka Kallasvuo, with Stephen Elop.
Enter Stephen Elop, a Canadian executive formerly with Microsoft.
Notably, the very first non-Finnish CEO in Nokia's 145-year history.
He was brought in as an outsider to make the hard choices that the entrenched, fearful management could not. And this initiates the most controversial era of our entire case study.
Let's look at the chessboard when Elop sits down. Symbian is clearly dying. It is too slow, too fragmented. The developer ecosystem is dead. But Nokia wasn't just sitting on Symbian.
No, they did have a backup plan. They had a massive internal R&D project called MeeGo.
And MeeGo was actually really promising based on the technical reviews. It was a modern, open-source, Linux-based operating system. They eventually released a device, the Nokia 9, running MeeGo, and the tech press genuinely loved it.
It was highly praised for its swipe-based interface, which felt very modern and fluid.
But the project was crippled by internal delays, a lack of ecosystem support, and that exact same corporate infighting we just discussed. The R&D division was essentially fighting a civil war.
One faction was desperately trying to patch Symbian to keep current revenues afloat. Another faction was building MeeGo, and there were even other experimental OS projects eating up budget.
Elop looks at this and recognizes that this fragmentation is unsustainable. He concludes that MeeGo development is simply too slow to create a full portfolio of devices across different price points in the time they have left.
The market is accelerating away from them. iOS and Android are gobbling up market share every single day.
Which leads directly to February 2011 and the infamous burning platform memo.
This memo is legendary in business schools.
Elop sends a company-wide memo comparing Nokia's situation to a man standing on a burning oil platform in the North Sea. He writes that the man has to choose between burning alive on the platform or plunging into the freezing, uncertain waters below.
He tells the company, "We are standing on a burning platform, and we must decide how we are going to change our behavior."
It was a dramatic, necessary wake-up call.
But the problem wasn't the metaphor. The problem was what he did next. Days after the memo leak, he makes the plunge. Nokia announces a broad, exclusive, strategic partnership with Microsoft.
They announced they are adopting Windows Phone as their primary smartphone OS, officially abandoning Symbian and effectively killing MeeGo.
And from an analytical perspective, this is where a necessary strategic pivot becomes a fatal, self-inflicted wound.
Because of the communication strategy.
Exactly. By issuing the burning platform memo and publicly announcing the death of Symbian, Elop triggered what is known in business strategy as the Osborne effect.
We should define the Osborne effect, as it is critical here. It is named after the Osborne Computer Corporation in the 1980s. Adam Osborne prematurely announced a next-generation computer long before it was ready to ship.
And what happened? Customers immediately stopped buying the current computer because they knew it was about to be obsolete. The company ran out of cash and went bankrupt before the new computer even launched.
And that is exactly what Nokia did to itself. Elop announced the absolute obsolescence of his company's entire current product line a full 7 months before they had a single Windows Phone ready to sell to the public.
It is baffling. They essentially killed their own sales overnight.
Mm-hmm.
If you walk into a phone store in March 2011, why on earth would you sign a 2-year contract for a Symbian phone when the CEO of the company just told the world the software is a dead end?
You wouldn't. And the sales of Symbian devices cratered even faster than Nokia's internal financial models had predicted,
depriving them of the crucial cash flow they desperately needed to survive the multi-year transition to Windows.
But we must also analyze why they chose Microsoft and Windows Phone in the first place, rather than adopting Google's Android, which was rapidly becoming the dominant free alternative to Apple.
Our sources go deep into this exact decision.
It wasn't just because Elop was a former Microsoft guy, though everyone assumes that.
No, it was driven by a deep institutional fear of commoditization. Management looked at the Android ecosystem, and they saw companies like Samsung, HTC, and Motorola engaged in a brutal race-to-the-bottom price war.
Nokia was terrified of becoming just another software-agnostic hardware vendor. They were a proud company. They wanted to control their destiny.
They believed that by partnering with Microsoft, they could offer a third distinct ecosystem. They believed that the sheer weight of the Nokia hardware brand, combined with Microsoft's software enterprise dominance, would compel consumers and developers to wait for them.
It was a massive overestimation of their own brand equity. They assumed customer loyalty would bridge a massive technology gap, but it didn't.
The Windows Phone platform was actually praised by reviewers for its clean, tiled user interface, but it suffered from a severe, insurmountable app gap.
Developers simply were not willing to spend resources building applications for a distant third-place operating system when iOS and Android offered massive, established, highly profitable user bases.
Without Instagram, without Google Maps, without the apps people use daily, the hardware didn't matter.
The resulting collapse in market share is breathtaking. It is one of the fastest corporate evaporations in history. From roughly 50% global market share in 2007, Nokia's share of the global smartphone market plummeted to just 3.4% by 2012.
A drop from 50 to 3.4%.
Their market capitalization, which had peaked at that staggering $250 billion, shrank to roughly $15 billion.
The massive, hyper-efficient factories they had optimized to churn out 15 phones a second were now bleeding money, operating far below capacity. Tens of thousands of employees were laid off globally. The economic impact on Finland itself was profound.
It all culminates in September 2013. Nokia formally announces the sale of its Devices and Services division, its entire legacy mobile phone business, to Microsoft for 5.4 billion euros.
A tiny fraction of its peak value.
And the tragedy of that transaction is compounded by what followed. Microsoft's attempt to integrate Nokia's hardware division and revive the Windows Phone ecosystem was a total failure.
Microsoft ultimately took an $8 billion write-down on the acquisition a couple of years later, essentially admitting the asset was completely worthless to them, and they exited the smartphone hardware business entirely.
Okay, so let's pause here, because we need to look at the narrative versus the data. When we look back at the Elop era, he is almost universally painted as the villain in the tech press, the Microsoft Trojan horse who sank the Finnish flagship.
That is the popular narrative, yes.
But based on the extensive internal evidence in our sources, the timeline doesn't support that. Wasn't he just the guy who inherited a ship that was already taking on water from 57 different holes? The Symbian rot, the matrix bureaucracy, the culture of fear, all of that predated him by half a decade.
The clinical evidence absolutely supports your conclusion. Elop made significant tactical errors, primarily the timing and public communication of the transition, which triggered that devastating Osborne effect. However, the structural failure of the company occurred between 2004 and 2010.
Under Carlos Wu and the matrix management.
Correct. By the time Elop arrived in late 2010, the technical debt was insurmountable, and the internal culture was largely incapable of executing a rapid pivot.
The decision to go with Windows over Android is fiercely debated, but frankly, even if they had chosen Android, Nokia would have been entering a saturated market incredibly late, burdened with bloated organizational structures.
Samsung had already claimed the Android crown.
It is a grim picture, but the narrative doesn't actually end in the graveyard of the handset division, because while the consumer-facing mobile phone business died a very public, humiliating death, the actual corporate entity of Nokia did something remarkable in the shadows.
They pulled off one of the greatest second acts in business.
Yes. The post-2013 restructuring is a masterclass in corporate survival, strategic divestment, and reinvention. Nokia did not go bankrupt. When they sold the handset division to Microsoft, they retained their massive patent portfolio, their mapping services, which they later sold to a consortium of German automakers, and their network infrastructure business.
And they pivoted hard into that infrastructure space.
The strategic moves here are aggressive and incredibly precise. First, in 2013, just before finalizing the sale of the phones to Microsoft, Nokia bought out Siemens' 50% stake in their joint venture, Nokia Siemens Networks, for 1.7 billion euros.
They took full, unilateral control of the network hardware business. They recognized that the invisible back end of the mobile revolution was just as lucrative and far less volatile than the consumer front end.
Then, in 2016, they execute a massive acquisition. They buy their French-American rival Alcatel-Lucent for 15.6 billion euros.
Which completely repositioned Nokia from a consumer electronics failure into a global titan of back-end network infrastructure.
Exactly. Alcatel-Lucent brought immense capabilities in fixed-line networks, optical networking, and critically, Bell Labs, one of the most prestigious research institutions in the world.
And we cannot understate the value of their intellectual property. Remember that 3.8 billion euros in R&D spending from 2005.
Right.
Decades of that level of relentless investment left Nokia with one of the most powerful foundational patent portfolios in the entire telecommunications industry.
Even though they are no longer manufacturing the phones in your pocket, they hold the foundational patents for the 3G, 4G, and 5G technologies that allow any mobile phone, including the iPhone, to connect to a network.
And they monetize that brilliantly. In 2016, they licensed the Nokia brand name to a new Finnish company called HMD Global.
HMD manufactures and sells Android-based Nokia smartphones today. Nokia takes zero manufacturing risk, holds zero inventory, but collects royalties on the brand name and the patents.
Today, the financial data proves the absolute success of this reinvention. Nokia is a leading global player in 5G network rollouts, boasting over 300 commercial 5G deals worldwide, competing directly and successfully with Ericsson and Huawei.
Their licensing and patent royalties division, Nokia Technologies, generates over 1 billion euros in operating profit annually. The margins on intellectual property licensing are incredibly high compared to manufacturing physical hardware.
It is a beautiful, almost poetic irony.
They lost the brutal, high-stakes war for the device in your hand, but they retreated, restructured, and ended up building the invisible highways that allow your device to work. It is like losing the race to build the fastest car, so you decide to own all the toll roads instead. You don't care what car someone drives because you get paid every time they get on the highway.
That is a very accurate assessment of their current business model. They shifted from a highly visible, hyper-competitive, trend-driven consumer market to a highly specialized, infrastructure-driven enterprise market.
It requires entirely different competencies, which they successfully secured through the Alcatel-Lucent acquisition and their continued R&D focus on next-generation networking.
As we conclude this deep dive, let's synthesize this journey. The story of Nokia is arguably the greatest business case study of the 21st century.
It is a masterclass in how optimizing for current success can completely destroy your future. They were the undisputed masters of hardware manufacturing, supply chain logistics, and quarterly profit generation.
But they were defeated by a paradigm shift towards software ecosystems, crippled by a toxic internal culture of fear where no one could tell the truth, and paralyzed by a reluctance to cannibalize their own legacy cash cow.
They built an empire on efficiency, but efficiency became the enemy of innovation.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the most chilling takeaway from the Nokia collapse is how completely invisible the rot can be, while the financial numbers still look spectacular. Success masks dysfunction. We look back at Nokia in 2008 and wonder how they could have been so blind to the threat of the iPhone. But right now, today, there is a massive tech giant dominating the global market, obsessively optimizing their current cash cow and fostering a corporate culture where middle management is afraid to speak up or challenge the core business model. Based on the timeline we just analyzed, that modern giant might already be dying internally, and we just won't see the revenue numbers drop for another 5 years. Who do you think it is?
That is a terrifying and brilliant question to leave them with. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the rise, fall, and rebirth of Nokia. Keep questioning the systems around you, keep looking for the cracks in the ice, and we will see you on the next investigation.